This episode is brought to you by America's Christian Credit Union, where your money grows and your values thrive. So you mentioned also in your intro there that you were part of the church, and then
Yes.
you left it for a while, and then you came back. I'd like to really get into your backstory. I'd like to know how your early beliefs were formed. I presume that you were born into some kind of a Christian or culture
Yes.
or family, and so let's start there. Tell me about your family and how you grew up before you actually rejected whatever that was.
Sure. I grew up in a Christian household. My family really got deep into church when I was around 8 years old. I went with my mother every week. My father wasn't a deep believer, but he wasn't a non-believer. But it was mostly my mother and I, and we would go, Sundays. We would go Wednesdays. I don't know if the Baptist people out there know the RAs, the Royal Ambassadors, and I was part of that. And church became a very big part of my life from about 8 years old on. I continue to be a part of that church, and it was a rather small church, maybe 200-300 people. So there's these really small groups of people. It's a smaller setting, and everybody becomes very close knit. So church was a very very core part of my growing up. And that was also in the 80s and the 90s. I'm dating myself here. It was the 80s and the 90s, and very fundamental church, very conservative church, very traditional church. I continued to go all the way up into my high school years. Like most people, I had some teenage strife going on in my life, and I had some, family issues and things like that. But church didn't waver at all at that point. It was kind of me learning to grow up and how to rectify how life actually happens versus what the church is telling me life is supposed to be. And there were always questions there. I think that's where I'll start. When I was a young teenager, there were questions and things I didn't understand. As I got a little older, I continued to ask more questions, and I'm a curious person. I think we'll probably talk about that a lot at the rest of the podcast. I'm a natural skeptic, a word that's, very near and dear to your podcast. I'm a natural skeptic. I'm not a cynic. I'm not a cynic. I don't believe in negativity or looking for the wrong in things, but I'm always looking for, if there's a question to be asked, I'm going to ask it, is basically how I would say that. Right. I continued to go through my faith walk. I continued to live in a very secular world in a very Christian, environment. So there's these it's this dichotomy of life that I was living in, and those two experiences didn't always add up. So it made for a lot of tension and questioning and asking. Now, the anchor to a lot of this was during the summer times. I would always go to these Christian conference camps and have these mountaintop experiences where I saw Jesus and I saw the glory of the Lord and said, this is what the world is really about. And then I go back to the secular world, and it just, the experiences didn't connect. And running into maybe 16, 17, 18, I started asking more serious questions. And the people in church couldn't or wouldn't answer. To this day, I don't know what the answer to that was. Like they couldn't or they wouldn't answer. And I still wanted to be faithful.
I imagine that was a bit of a struggle. Can you recall some of those questions that were burdening you? I mean, obviously there was a disconnect between what those mountaintop experiences and what you were
Right.
experiencing probably at high school. But what were some of those questions that were rising up in you that it felt like weren't being answered, or they wouldn't be answered, or they would, they couldn't answer them?
It's funny because at the time they felt super big, and now they feel very basic. Now that I'm older, they feel very basic. It's like, why does God let bad things happen? Now, I mean, why do we see children starving in countries, and why does that allow? Why are people captured as prisoners of war and tortured and die in captivity after 20 years without any chance to come back? Like things like that. And I just wasn't getting answers to those types of questions. And I think when I step back and look at my questions, I go to church, and it's not about suffering. It's about joy and release and calm and peace. And yet you walk out of the church doors, and all of a sudden, uh, you're in this secular environment where people are not being kind and good and caring and thoughtful to each other. And if it's so right, why aren't other people seeing this? If it is true, why aren't other people connecting with it? Why aren't they aligning with it? And just the questions I would ask, I wouldn't get any types of answers for those. And again, I never blamed anybody for that. It was never a blame game, but this natural skepticism of needing some sort of answer was enough to make me, I don't know, it created a tension inside me, which ultimately it kind of came to a head at, again, 18 years old. After I graduated high school, I had another one of these mountaintop experiences, decided I really wanted to be a pastor. If I'm having this secular universe world where everything's not the way I want it to be, but everything's great in church, I need to dedicate my life to being in church. If I can't rectify why this and this can't be together, I'm going to separate myself from this and go to this. Was kind of my thought process. It's a very simple thought process now as I'm older and a bit more mature, but it was a thought process nonetheless. And so at 18, I went to a Christian college and I started learning about becoming a pastor and learning about the Old Testament and the New Testament. I started getting into it. And I don't want to call out any names, but I'll tell you that at some point while I was in that school, we started to come up with some challenges of the Bible as we were learning the Bible, how there are things that seemingly contradict, which again, as I look back, I realized had I just been patient enough to get through the challenges, I probably would have gotten there. But I'm asked the professor directly to his face and hoping to get a real answer. I said, I'm not going to say his name, but Professor, you are a PhD. You are a super intelligent man. You're one of the most intelligent people I know. And you're teaching me about these contradictions, these challenges, these complications. How do you rectify it? I was looking for a mentor to rectify this for me. And his words were, I have faith. And I understand, again, in retrospect, I understand that was a positive thing to say. I have faith. Because what he meant by faith is not what I heard him mean by faith. What I heard him mean by I have faith is a noun. I hold it in my heart. I have it. And because I have it, I don't need to ask questions or I don't worry about the answers. And so that made me think, again, as an 18-year-old kid with no real direction, that if I am asking the questions, I obviously don't have the faith. I wasn't blessed with this faith you speak of, this noun that you speak of. And I ultimately left the church because of that. Because I said, if I continue to ask questions and people keep telling me that the answer is have faith, have faith, have faith, have faith, and I can't have faith, then this isn't meant for me. Again, it's a misunderstanding. And in retrospect, I understand that it's a misunderstanding, but it set me off on a really strange and unusual journey. One that I kind of think God meant for me to be on.
It's very disconcerting, isn't it? When you build your life and your hope on something you feel like is fairly solid, and then you start testing the ground, and the ground becomes a little bit more fragile, and there seems to be nothing holding it up.
Yeah.
At least that was your perception
at
the time.
It was.
And I can see at that age and stage, and you may not have been aware of perhaps a lot more resources other than your professor, the smart one, who should have known, but didn't, or led you in a direction or opened the door to deconstruction, I guess you could say, to deconstructing your faith.